Greetings, brothers and sisters and people of goodwill. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Dioppian Style. My name is Chuck Penn, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to let you know that is joining us today is Professor Manu Ampim. And Professor Ampim has a very impressive background. In fact, I've been trying to get this brother on tape since the 1990s. Back when I was doing my show, he was going to and fro across Europe and all these different museums and documenting forgeries and what have you, and discovering our history. We got him here today. He's just written a new book entitled A History of African Civilizations. Professor Ampim is a historian and a primary first-hand researcher specializing in African and African-American history and culture. He has a BS degree in business administration and a master's in history and African-American studies. His master's thesis, The Revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr., is being expanded into a 2-volume work entitled Martin Luther King, The Evolution of a Revolutionary. He's taught at the Department of History at Morgan State University in Baltimore and at San Francisco State University in the Department of Ethnic Studies. Also, Professor Ampim has studied at Oxford University in England and has collaborated on a NASA-sponsored research project which examined the ancient climate and migration patterns in Africa. Currently, Professor Ampim teaches history at Contra Costa College in San Pablo, California, and Africana Studies study abroad at Merritt College out of Oakland, California. He is teaching a 7-step primary research methodology course at Advancing the Research. Well, first of all, Professor Ampim, thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you teach and have a very vibrant schedule, so we really appreciate you taking time to spend with us to tell us about your new book, which is A History of African Civilizations. And my first question, sir, is why is it at this juncture of your career, because you've been at this for quite some time, have you decided to pen this book? Why now?
Well, I appreciate it, Brother Chuck, for the opportunity to share this. Thank you for the question, share some reflections with you and also with the audience. Well, my book, A History of African Civilization, actually, it derives from my primary or first-hand research that I've been conducting now for over 30 years. And I teach some of the material in a course that I teach at Contra Costa College here in Northern California, and it's dealing with African civilizations. So because there's no real serious materials on this topic that deals just with African civilizations before derailment, before enslavement, and before Africa's demise, I use my own material, my own first-hand research. So rather than just teaching this in the classroom with PowerPoint slides and handouts and some of my essays, I decided to combine this into first a reader for students to use to make it more user-friendly for them. And obviously, to just keep it at the level of a reader for a classroom is useful but limited. So I decided to make it available for the community and the public at large to really focus on a lot of the primary research that I've been doing in museums, institutes, and libraries in different countries that have stolen African artifacts, but also the work that I've been doing in the field at pyramid sites, temple sites, tomb sites, and ancient residential sites, and to make that available to the public. So that's really what my goal is to have a huge influence so that we can understand African civilizations on a much deeper level from an inside point of view, rather than looking at Africa from the outside eyes of contempt. So rather than looking at Africa from as an object of contempt, I wanted to make sure that the reader understood Africa from the point of view of the subject of respect and not the object of contempt. And clearly the book is a way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Why is it important for African heritage people to know in an intimate way about our history? Why is that important?
That's the age-old question. It's one of the most crucial questions, because somebody can always say, well, why are we focusing on Africa and ancient Africa when we have contemporary problems? Yeah, well, that's always a relevant question. But the importance for us is that it's about memory. it's about having a understanding of the past, because the present is based on the past, and anybody separates their life there and present today, they don't have a future, because what would it be based on? So for us, we have to root our culture in its African context and condition, because clearly, if you look at our situation in the U.S. and beyond, people of African descent, we're dependent on somebody else for food, shelter, clothing, education, transportation, healthcare. That's not always been that way. So when a group is in a position that is in, like we are, it's either one or two possibilities. Either we've always been this way, we've been second-class citizens, we've been descendants of slaves and dependent on somebody else for our basic survival, or that we never had another way, or we had a way and we lost our way. And that's what has happened to us. We've lost our way. We've forgotten the traditions that have worked out a lot of the problems that we're looking to solve today. And that's what our task is. So we look at African greatness. Africa, when it's at the apex of human achievement in art and science and literature and math and architecture, social organization, working out some of the great problems in the world and solving them, and having civilizations that are the apex of achievement. What happened to those days? We've lost our memory. So we're suffering from historical amnesia, and our task is to remember those days. My brother, we're not talking about building pyramids, actual physical pyramids here in the U.S. That's not logical, it's not reasonable, but it's also irrational to not take the principles and practices that allowed us to be great in the old days and to apply those principles and practices today in order to rebuild. That's what our task is. And it's folly and foolish to separate ourselves from this high level of achievement and simply relegate ourselves to be nothing but, and I do respect the ancestors, but to relegate ourselves to nothing but descendants of slaves. And as the great Kwame Ture said, if you start your history in slavery, the best you can be is a good slave. So we want to always make sure we're not limited to that, because that's the more recent part of our history, and look at the grand scope of our experience. So we have to look at our experience going back to Africa and look at the whole experience as a novel. In order to understand a novel, we have to read it from cover to cover. Nobody can just arbitrarily jump into chapter 3 or page 108, think they can understand the entire story. It doesn't work that way in real life. We have to look at the complete story so we can know where we are and what our next contribution will be in order to get ourselves out of this current quagmire. But we cannot do that by separating ourselves from the great contributions on the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of those contributions, give us some highlights about what's in your new book.
Well, I appreciate it. The book, it starts off dealing with the origin of human societies going back to about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapiens, that originated in East Africa. And that's like the first section. And then the bulk of the book is dealing with African civilizations around the continent, starting with the classical African civilizations in the Nile Valley in Northeast Africa, starting with the oldest of them, Kush, and then Nubia, and then Kemet in the Nile Valley. But also a survey of the other great civilizations such as Aksum and the contributions there, the Kingdom of Buganda and the Great Zimbabwe, and looking at all of the continental contributions from West Africa and those early high-level civilizations there. People know about Ghana, Mali, Songhai, but these are civilizations. We can look at the entire continent. I also focus on what influence Africans had in Europe. For example, the Moorish influence in Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, and for almost 800 years, from 711 to 1492 of the Common Era. And then also Africans coming to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere before slavery, before colonialism, going back to the early Olmec period, at least 3,000 years ago. So the book is looking at this from an inside perspective, from looking at the firsthand evidence and records. And it's for the general public, but the book also is for those who want to teach this, because there's not only this information and perspective, but also there's lesson plans and resources for those who want to look at each section and be able to teach that even without much background. So I wanted to make sure that the textbook was very useful for the specialist as well as the layperson who is not very familiar with it, or even professors at the high school or even the college level.
Here's what I struggle with, brother. I struggle with the timelines. I mean, I was looking at a graphic that a brother that teaches African history, African American history, and I think there were like 13 different timelines from Manetho in the third century BC through Chinweizi in 1999. And so what I struggle with is the BC before Christ, the BCE before the Common Era, AD, and then there's another one. Is it
The
AP?
CE,
So I'm sorry.
the C, the CE. So you got BCE before the Common Era, and then CE, the Common Era.
Right. And so
Yes.
the variation on some of these timelines could be is 1,000 or more years. Which one do you base yours on?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. One of the first things that's important as a professional historian, a lot of people can claim titles and all that, but this is actually my profession, what I've been trained to do and what I've been doing independently in the field as well for more than 3 decades. But one of the first things to start with is when we're looking at history and what has happened in the past, is everything has to be put in historical context. That's the first rule. Historical context is 2 elements. There's time and place. So everything has to be put in a time and place perspective. So everything starts with historical context. If not, it just sounds like Alice in Wonderland or Once Upon a Time. That's why the average person who's not too familiar, to be cool, to be hip, to be up to date, and also to indicate that they don't know, there's no historical context. But what we do here is people will just kind of cover the fact that they're not really clear about it. They'll say, well, back in the day, in Africa, they did. No. Back in the day, what do you mean? Whose day? What day? What are you talking about? We don't speak that way as professionals. What do you mean? So it's all about time and place. So there's a lot of timelines out, but what's most important as we put everything in a historical context, time and place, and we look at the chronological record. In other words, a time sequence. So for me, dates are easy. I've been doing it a while. Numbers are not a challenge, but this is why I said earlier, we look, the book covers the advanced civilizations of ancient Kush and then Nubia and then Kemet. Kush goes so far back into antiquity that we don't even have a date for the origins of it. As Chancellor Williams, the great first-hand researcher, said, the further we go back, it seems to be ready-made. There doesn't seem to be any period of, development. It's developed the further we go back. So, and the Kush is in the heartland of Kush is in current day Sudan. But my field research is not just in Sudan, but hopefully I'll be going back, and I'm planning actually to go back to South Sudan. That holds a very crucial key to the origins and significance of ancient Kush. But the key is to really look at the chronologies and timelines in that manner. But everything has to be put in historical context. And you did mention one of the important writers, Manetho, who was the African priest who can translate the Medu Neter or hieroglyphs. And when the Greek foreigners came around in the 4th century before the Common Era, they couldn't read any African words or terms, and they certainly couldn't write. So they employed Manetho, and what he did was he actually created a history of ancient Kemet by creating a dynastic system or a dynasty or a series of rulers. And he created 30 dynasties. So the Manetho framework, even though it's more than 2,000 years old, it holds up. It makes sense. Some things we may question, like why would he split the 17th and 18th dynasty when these are one family? But it makes sense though, his time frame and timeline. So I always tell people, if we start with historical context, that will help us to understand and give everything meaning, as opposed to the once upon a time, back in the day type of approach.
Well, folks, I've been trying to get this brother on tape since the 1990s. And I don't know whether you remember it or not, but we've had a couple of telephone conversations. That's back when I was doing my show before the white folks ran me out of town. The powers that be thought that perhaps I needed to engage in a different kind of content. They were a little uncomfortable with me having the Malefi Asantes and folks like that on my show. But when I was talking with him back then, he was going through all these European museums that have all these stolen African artifacts. And he was documenting the thefts, not only the thefts, but the forgeries, and taking note of how a lot of our artifacts were hidden or in the basement or weren't in highly visible areas. Talk about that, brother.
Well, I appreciate it. When I first started to do my primary or first-hand research, it was in 1989 and 90. I actually lived in Europe for a year, and mainly in England. And I used England as a base for that year. And I went to all the European museums, institutes, and libraries throughout Europe. I went to 11 countries. I went to East Germany and West Germany. Now they're one Germany. Austria, Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden. And I went to large and small collections alike because I was in search of all of the artifacts and documents that I can find. I told people, I don't know how long I'm going to be gone from the U.S. I told them anywhere from 3 months to 2 years. I had no idea. I knew I had resources to last for at least 3 months. And but I was able to stay a year. And so what I began to notice, and my first goal was just to document that the people in the Nile Valley were African, because I knew that delusional people who like to distort the historical records were arguing elsewhere. And I just wanted to document that people in Kemet in that area of Northeast Africa were African, but I noticed a pattern, and that is the systematic misrepresentation, distortion, and alteration of artifacts in one collection after another. I was stunned that paints on statues and reliefs were systematically scraped off, and you can see only the traces of the darker paint if you look carefully. I noticed in that regard the dark legs, colorless face phenomena. So if you look at a relief, you look at the legs and the color's there, but most people never look at that. But as you go up the statue by the chest and face area, no paint, unless you're looking for traces of it, which I was able to find and document. And I started to notice the pattern. I started to notice much more than the average person would ever notice, and that is that, yes, noses are knocked off of statues, but what is far more common is not noses knocked off. That's obvious. But what's more common is behind the scenes conspirators. I'm talking about archaeologists, Egyptologists, and museum curators, restorers, conservationists. They're the ones after discovery that have doctored up statues and reliefs to not just knock noses off. No, they're more sophisticated than that. It's the de-Africanization by changing the shape of the nose, by scrubbing not only the paint away, but making sure it's a much thinner nose. And you can only notice that if you're looking at it with the eye of an optometrist, where you can see that here you have a smooth, it could be made of limestone, basalt, whatever it is. But then when you look carefully right underneath, you say, wow, why is it only rough around the bridge of the nose to give it a straighter, narrower, aquiline nose appearance?
Mm-hmm.
And I started
but even that, But excuse me, I'm sorry, but even that doesn't prove anything, because I think one of the things that Dr. Ben talked a lot about was the fact that the misnomer that there is an African look, that, to be African, you got to have broad nose, thick lips, high cheekbones. But Africa, in fact, historically has had a wide range of different looks. Am I correct?
That's correct. But let's also be clear. In the Nile Valley, we don't have any super light-skinned people. They're not indigenous. So the conspirators are very clear of a racial type, a particular type, a look. Even if there's variations within that look, you don't get a European type with thin nose, thin lips, blue eyes, white skin. That didn't exist. It did not exist. So they created this look. And I started to document this in museum after museum, but then also more than the doctoring up of statues, more than the systematic, dastardly criminal de-Africanization, was outright forgeries, the absolute invention of artifacts that didn't exist. This is what I was able to document. So in 1994, I went to Kemet. I went in 90, I went back in 94, and I began to see the same thing in the field, particularly at temples like the Karnak temple. I did a lot of work there. I spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours there looking at temples, looking at tombs, on site, on scene, and in some cases, the criminals, which is what they are, at work, literally chipping away at facial features. And I documented this with photograph, my notes, and video to show this. And so this is when I began to write a series called The Vanishing Evidence of Classical African Civilizations. So I started writing the Vanishing Evidence series in 1994, and people can still find that series because I will always add to it as new criminal elements have to be exposed, and it continues to take place today. Just was it earlier this year? Time moves. Yeah, I think it was this year. I was out in the field. Sorry, it was the end of last year, end of 2022, and at the Karnak Temple in Luxor, the Avenue of Sphinxes connecting the Karnak and Luxor Temple has been restored as of 2021, a mile and a half long. It's one of the great festivals, the Opet Festival, where they lined up more than 1,200 sphinxes on either side that would be the processional route. One of the greatest festivals. But yet, if you take a look at these restored sphinxes, you see that, again, even now, they've doctored up images to make them look as un-African as possible. So I'm talking about the same conspirators, the so-called conservationists, the phony restorers, the fake archaeologists, and the biased Egyptologists who are bent on misrepresenting history by misrepresenting images. They always attack the paints, they attack the facial structures, and some of it was so absurd, brother, that people online were shocked and stunned that people would be that careless, they would be involved with that kind of open public crime against humanity, because these are World Heritage monuments, and yet they get away with it. But it's really shocking that this is still going on. So my Vanishing Evidence series is the only series that I'm aware of where there's been an ongoing multi-year focus on this kind of outrageous fraud that we must expose and condemn.
And to tell you the truth, Professor Ampim, I'm surprised that you were able to discipline yourself over a series of years to do this, because I would think that Zawi Hawass would kind of get in the way of you or prevent you from even visiting some of these antiquities. Did you run into that?
Good point. Well, not directly. I've attacked Hawass in the Vanishing Evidence series as academic fraud and somebody who was delusional. In one of the series, he completely misrepresents the presentation and the look, the appearance of King Tutankhamun. The original artifacts present him as a clear Africoid ruler, but then the 2005 forensic reconstructions present him as the brothers and sisters in LA called him, the Boy George image. But he's completely
that's exactly what he looked.
Yeah, so, and Hawass is responsible for that. He says that all these images are similar. They're not similar. You got people who are making up wild 21st century 2005 images, and attacked Awad is an academic fraud. And people, and I even did a recording in the King Tutankhamun tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and some people got nervous, and the travel agent, and some of them got nervous that we may lose our license and all that. So I had to make it non-public. But if I had gone on my own with my own visa, then I'm not taking anything down. They want to come get me, come get me. Want to deny a visa, then I'll just make it political. But the crimes are absolutely absurd. And for people to run around now like Zahi Hawass and others, like he's concerned about a Cleopatra movie when he's been in the forefront of some of the most gross misrepresentation of an African identity. And he claims that Africans were not in Kemet, they had nothing to do with it, weren't even in the vicinity. He reminds me of Herman Juncker, who wrote an outrageous article in 1960, which I found in Europe when I was traveling in one of the museum in London. Herman Juncker, the title of the article, "The First Appearance of the Negro in History." And according to Herman Juncker, Black folks didn't even appear until the 18th dynasty. Really? So the first 17 dynasty were not Black folks. But this is what we're dealing with. And so I can care less about an opponent. If they want to come after me, and then let's go. Let's get it on. Let's make it happen.
And they don't have the documents. They don't have the artifacts. They don't have the proofs. And I think that's how brothers like you and Dr. Clark, Dr. Ben, Amilfi Asante, and Diop, of course, Ivan Van Sertima, y'all have really brought it. And in fact, I see you as advancing the knowledge, advancing the research. We've lost a lot of those brothers now, but I thank God we've got you and others, Brother Browder, and some folks that are still out there advancing the knowledge base for us. So we appreciate that. Tell me now, what historical notables out of ancient Africa should every Black person, every person with African blood running through their veins should know about?
Well, there's many. I would say there's a reason for why I chose as the cover of my book, A History of African Civilization. There's a reason why I chose King Taharka as on the front cover. Taharka, the king and the great ruler from Kush in the 8th century before the Common Era, Taharka is the greatest builder in the history of ancient Kush. Everybody should know about this great prolific builder. And his leadership. And, he's the greatest builder in the history of Kush, but the greatest builder, period, was Ramses II. And Ramses, some 500 years or so before Taharka, he's the single greatest builder. He was a prolific builder with tremendous monuments and temples and colossal statues. I mean, what a builder. What a builder. The great Ramses. But there's so many to really name, but I would say, if the average person wants to know about African influence of a civilization, then they cannot overlook the great Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa is said to be, because of his wealth, the wealthiest person in the history of humanity, because all of the gold that the Mali Empire sat on top of in the 1300s. And Mansa Musa was wealthy, was strong, was powerful. And, I can go down the list because, there's so many powerful women leaders. Queen T, there's the great Tedashiri, which most people would not know about from Kemet. There's the Kendaki queens from Kush. And you have these queen pyramids, great structures in Sudan. They loom in majesty. Amenashe Keto and others, very, very powerful women. You have also not only these kings and queens, but also you have people of high status, such as, great people who made great contributions like Ptah-hotep, who wrote the first book in the history of humanity about 4,400 years ago. Awesome. He wrote 37 lessons on ethical and moral conduct. Or do we want to talk about the first known female doctor in the history of the world? Sheshet. It's Sheshet, about 2,500 or so before the Common Era, or 4,500 years ago. We can go down, or Hatshepsut, the greatest builder of all the female rulers. I mean, she built prolifically. Hatshepsut ruling for 20 years peacefully, but a tremendous builder. I mean, where do we want to start? And that's just the elite, but just you have other people, some of the great writers, Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, and you can tell that they came from an illustrious past. You see the execution of their tombs and the execution of their statues and artifacts. They're made by some of the greatest stonemasons who took absolute care to make sure that everything was in pristine state. And that alone indicates the high level status, and so a lot of people, they love to say we're from kings and queens. I don't focus on that so much, because being a king and queen or descendants of them is nice, but it doesn't mean everything. Because if you look at Europe, the kings were imperialists. They were slave owners. They were brutal. So being descended from a king and queen is not enough. But in an African context, it definitely means everything. But if you look at the execution of things, just for the average person, we have to be very impressed with the kind of societies that Africans set up based on truth and justice, and a righteous society that's able to last hundreds and thousands of years. That's not easy to do. at all. But it can only be done when you have worked out social issues and social problems, as we see the Kushites done. I mean, the Kushites had such a generous society that foreigners commented on. Every night they would have a table of the sun that they would put out food and drink for anyone in the society or any travelers, and just very hospitable, honorable, generous people that was commented on by all. You know, it was the it's the elite, yes, but it's also how they were able to organize societies to last because people were taken care of. It wasn't about hoarding wealth and making sure that the poor never had a footing in the society, not like Greece, where 80% of the people were not citizens, only the elite. How the hell could so-called democracy be originated in Greece when the vast majority of people in democracy is supposed to be a government of the people, for the people, by the people, yet the people had no rights. Women had no rights in Greece. Slaves had no rights in Greece. Poor had no rights in Greece. Foreigners had no rights in Greece. So where's the democracy? It was a democracy for a few. However, on the other hand, Africa has extended these resources of the society for the average people. So to me, this is also as great as it is when we see the illustrious rulers who built for eternity, who built mighty monuments. Who's the greatest builder? Ramses, but yet you got competition. Look at Sennacherib. He built not one, not two, but 3 pyramids with hundreds of thousands of pounds of masonry. I mean, what a builder. And they were building for eternity, and these monuments last. I say we take not just the monuments, but the principles and practices that allowed Africans to build these mighty structures that still confound the world. So I look at the high level builders, but I also have to look at the rest of the society as well and see that that also functioned very well.
You know, we've got a lot of false misinformation that's being spread by a lot of folk on social media right now. How do we get in the ears of our young people to teach them who they are? And does your 7-step, research methodology come into play? In other words, it's just as bad for Europeans to falsify our history, to hide our history, to co-opt our history, to take credit for our history. It's just as bad when we spew or articulate false information about our past. How do we get a handle on that? Because I see a lot of brothers and sisters out there are spreading information that cannot be supported. First of all, how do we get in their ear to teach them who they are?
It's tough. You know, I have a group of young people that I teach every day at the college, every semester. And, and every now and then I can help some of them come with me on the educational tours to the continent during the summer. But for the larger young group of young people out there, we have to meet them where they are in terms of social media. So they're on, all these different social media platforms, and I have a pretty big following on Facebook, so I catch them there, and of course, we have a presence on the others as well, but that's probably the biggest audience there, and also on YouTube. It's like a lot of times they don't want anything too complicated, or that they got to do work. They're used to the easy things. Sit back at home, press a few buttons, and then they can learn something. But they're learning nonsense and garbage in most places. Some of it is outrageous, it's absurd, has nothing to do with facts, but it has a wow factor. Oh, I didn't know that. It has this wow factor. But I do know that sometimes people are intelligent enough to send something to me and ask me if I could give my feedback on it, because I know that that's the form in which many people will want to receive information. So if they don't buy the book, or if they they can look at my YouTube channel. But other than that, we really do have to meet them where they are. And so if it's not conferences that they'll be at, or we can get them to go to conferences, then we just have to deal with them online and draw traffic to those conferences or presentations or information that they can really learn some legitimate information. Because this is why I have to be online in order to make sure that I can have some presence to meet them. But I think that's our best, most effective way in a mass sense to get to them. But the other thing is that it doesn't always have to be that elaborate. People should be teaching and teaching folks around them. People have family members, young family members, and they can do the little big things that make all the difference in the world. Not just call them up and let's just talk. Let's go out as young brother with the young brothers or the young sisters, and let's just go out and talk. Whatever, it could be at the beach, it could be for lunch, it could be whatever it is, it could be even online, whatever the case. But folks don't always do that. They think, Brother Chuck, that folks have to have some men's group. You don't need a men's group. That's fine. You have a group of brothers that want to mentor young folks, and that was very popular in the 90s and the 80s and 90s, the rites of passage. That's fine. But you don't always need a group to do something yourself. So to me, what are people doing on a daily and weekly basis to reach young folks that they have around them?
And what about the not so young folks? I mean, let's face it. I mean, if you're a parent, whether you're 30 or 40s, or if you're a grandparent for that matter, and if you don't have that knowledge, in fact, there's a lot of seniors, that are older than me who run from their Africanness. You tell them they're African and they get pissed off because, Africa has this connotation of being something primitive and negative. They don't know that history. So, what you end up with is a perpetual cycle, because if the old folks don't know their history and the not so old folks don't know their history and the young folks don't know their history, you have to know it. You have to know who you are if you're going to pass that on. So I guess that also applies to a lot of the not so young folks as well.
Well, it does. And you actually bring up a point that I think is good to mention here. And so let me flip the script for most of the people. Most people say that, we got to get to the youth, we got to teach the youth so that they can begin to learn. I agree. However, my view is very different. And it's because of my practice in the field. If I had we want to influence everybody. That's important. That we have a broad-based message that incorporates. So if anybody comes to my events, for example, yes, absolutely, they're going to see the vast majority of people of African descent, but they also will see people from all other backgrounds learning, humbly learning. Not there to spy them if they were. It doesn't make a difference. They're getting the information. But you see a diversity of people. And I don't change. I don't water anything down. It's just that there are decent people who say, wow, I never knew this. So this is why my African civilizations class, if somebody came and saw, right now we're on Zoom, and saw, yeah, you got more Black people in that class than other classes. However, take a look. You got Asian, you got white, you got people from different backgrounds, because they too, and I go around the room, why are you taking a class? Hey, I like the title. Wanted to know. All I know is about African Americans and slavery. This seemed to be different. And they telling it like it is. But my choice would be this. If I can't influence everybody, and I had a choice to either influence a group of young people or a group of elders, I'm going to always take the elders, because the reason why that's more important, if we only had that choice, is because the elders, the older folks, are going to influence not only their peers, but multiple generations. It's the elders that will influence their children and their grandchildren. So we get more influence by focusing on the elders if we had no other choice. Yes, it's great to focus on young people, but we learned that if you have like a program that you have youth in, if the parent doesn't support that when those youth get home, they're going to undo much of what you presented. So you got to recruit the parents. They got to be a part of it so they can help with the ongoing teaching process and the reinforcement. But I love being, and let's face it, the elders, older folks, they're wiser. They understand things they didn't learn. They're hungry. They want to know, and they gravitate towards my work the most. One of the most interesting calls I got a couple of years ago, I was doing a presentation for the Brother to Brother group here in the Oakland area, and they were talking about biblical issues and people and places, but they didn't know enough about African civilization. So they asked if I would come in and do a presentation, and that turned into a 6-week seminar and then another 4-week seminar. My family's from Mobile, Alabama. So somebody said, hey, Mr. Morris he was going to call you. He was really impressed. And it turned out that Mr. Walt Morris, or Dr. Walt Morris, 99-year-old Walt Morris, very sharp, sounded like he was 50 years old to me, no more than 60, said this is the greatest information, and educated, all of that. So this is the greatest information he ever learned in his life, And I said, wow, very, very sharp. So I had him on my radio program and so forth. But I would always rather, if having a choice, no other choice, is to get to the elders, because I know it's going to have a much wider impact than just the young people. It's great to start young if we can get them. And by the way, my recent tour to Kemet this past June, everybody was pretty much an experienced traveler. They had traveled before, and I can't say offhand what the average age is, but I believe it's accurate to say that everybody was over 40 or maybe even 50, other than one. We were able to organize a scholarship for one student. He's not even a student of mine at the college. This is 16-year-old Kelfani. And he held his own.
That's all right. It's all right.
He held his own, and I'm teaching and guiding him, because look, the other last thing, brother, too, is that we go and learn. But one of the most critical things that's overlooked 99% of the time is proper documentation. So I'm teaching people, guiding them, no, don't take the picture that way. Don't do the point and shoot. You need to zoom in. Oh, no, we can just cut it later. I said, you don't understand. It's not going to have the same quality when we want to publish. Remember, we are establishing a record. So like the ancestors were building for eternity, we must use the equipment today to have our records last. So no, don't shoot it that way. I need you to zoom in. Hey, so what I love today, when we take pictures, I can stop everybody. Say, okay, nobody move. Let me check, because it's a digital. Let me check to see if it's good enough. And all that kind of stuff. But the young guy, so our ages were from 16 to 80, whatever, early 80s with this trip. So I love that range. Most were elders, but we also invest in young people as needed as well.
Well, brother, we want to get you back on here again. Manu and I were talking before we started rolling tape that I told him this is just a little preview, because I want him to come back and I want him to do a presentation of what he has accumulated in terms of knowledge over all these decades, and to show us graphically, visually, some of these great historical notables that we all need to know about. So before I let you go, where can we get your book? I mean, I've ordered mine. I was hoping I had it for today, but but it's coming. Where can folks get your book?
Thank you. So my book, A History of African Civilizations, literally just off the press, the second edition, you can get it directly from us, advancingtheresearch.org, advancingtheresearch.org.
I'll be sure to put that up on the screen as well.
Yes, sir. And then if they go to the news link, you'll see the publication, and you go right to the publication itself. Yeah, you can get it from Amazon, but what we say is that why give the middle person or the middle company a cut from our work? So go directly to advancingtheresearch.org and you find it. And then also one last thing too, brother, is that people misspell my last name. So let me spell it.
Go
Manu,
ahead.
and then Ampim, Ampim. Last letter's an M. When people see M, somehow they change it to an N, and they don't always.
See, I'm guilty from years ago. I had to double check it before today, as a matter of fact, to make sure it was Ampim. Yes, yes, indeed. Well, brother, thank you so very much for taking out time, and let's get our heads together, because I want you to do a presentation. I saw one of yours online, and I was just mesmerized. I'm saying, this brother is bringing it. If I could delve into some ebonics here. You really got it going on, man. I really appreciate all that you've done. And it really is encouraging to me to see brothers like you, advancing the research, doing original, authentic, documentable research. And in the legacy of, many of the scholars that came before you, the John G. Jacksons, the Ivan Van Sertima's, the Chancellor Williams, all of those brilliant scholars. So thank you so very much. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you, brother. I appreciate the opportunity. It's my pleasure and my duty.
All right. We'll be talking soon.
Okay.
All right now.